At its peak, 40,000 people walked through these gates every single morning. 40,000. That's not a workforce. That's a city moving on shift. They built cars that filled Britain's roads. They built machines that carried a country through war. And for 70 years, this stretch of East London marshland was the beating heart of Europe's most ambitious industrial machine. Then, on a grey February morning in 2002, a cherry-red Ford Fiesta rolled off the line. And the machines went quiet. Not because of war, not because of collapse, and not because Ford ran out of money, but because somewhere far away, in a system designed to compare everything against everything else, London was no longer the answer. It was just the most expensive option. Dagenham was done. This is the story of a man in Michigan who tried to rebuild industry on an English swamp. How that experiment became an empire. How 187 women with sewing machines rewrote British law. And how in the end, the empire didn't fall. It was simply turned off. 40,000 workers, 11 million vehicles, 71 years. Welcome to Dagenham. Chapter 1. An idea from Michigan. Henry Ford was born in 1863 on a Michigan farm. He hated the work. Not the land, but the inefficiency of it. He later wrote, "Even when I was very young, I suspected that much of the farm work could somehow be done in a better way. That is what took me into mechanics." That sentence contains the entire Ford Motor Company. He left the farm at 16, apprenticed as a machinist, and spent the next 2 decades obsessing over engines. In 1896, he built his first car in the shed behind his house. When he tried to wheel it out, the doorway was too narrow. He picked up a hammer and knocked the wall down. That was always the pattern. By 1908, Ford had the car he believed in, the Model T. Light, simple, affordable. His stated intention, "I will build a motor car for the great multitude." As production scaled, costs fell. As costs fell, he cut the price. In 1908, a Model T cost $850. By 1926, a better version cost $310. By 1918, 1 in every 2 cars on American roads was a Model T. In 1913, the moving assembly line at Highland Park reduced build time from 12 hours to 2.5. In 1914, he paid his workers $5 a day, double the industry rate, because he wanted them to be able to afford what they built. Workers as customers, the factory and the market as the same population. High wages, low prices, high volume. The same idea, expressed 3 different ways, but the system he built, the one that made him unstoppable, would one day make places like Dagenham disposable. A machine that always optimizes has no loyalty to the places it leaves behind. That logic crossed the Atlantic in 1931. It landed on marshland beside the Thames, east of London, and it built an empire. Chapter 2. Building an empire on a swamp. In 1911, Ford opened its first British factory at Trafford Park in Manchester. A converted shed, assembling parts shipped from America. It wasn't much, but the logic was clear. Import tariffs were high. The British market was large, and if you wanted to sell cars here at scale, you had to build them here. Trafford Park filled up fast. Within a decade, it was too small. Ford needed something built from scratch, self-sufficient, with its own power station, its own blast furnace, its own deep-water dock. The same logic as River Rouge in Detroit, transplanted to English soil, a Detroit in miniature beside the Thames. In 1923, Ford surveyed 37 sites across Britain. The requirements were specific: deep-water river access, national rail connections, a reliable labor supply close by. One location kept coming back, a stretch of marshland on the north bank of the Thames in Dagenham, Essex. Flat. Empty. Nothing but mud, reed beds, and river fog. On paper, it looked like a problem. Ford saw a factory. On the 10th of July, 1924, Ford purchased 307 acres for £167,700. For Essex marshland, it was a remarkable sum. For what was being planned, it was a bargain. Construction began in 1929. Edsel Ford flew to England to cut the first turf himself. The ground was Thames alluvium, soft, unstable, incapable of supporting a major factory without serious intervention. Engineers drove 22,000 concrete piles deep into the clay beneath. The work took 28 months. When it was finished, Dagenham had everything: a private jetty on the Thames for bulk deliveries, a coke oven, a blast furnace, its own power station, a foundry, a machine shop, an assembly building the size of several city blocks, and a private railway running the length of the entire site. Nothing like it existed anywhere else in Europe. Morris didn't have it. Opel didn't. Citroën didn't. Dagenham was the largest, most self-contained car factory on the continent. The opening had a certain Ford bluntness to it. Over the weekend of the 19th and 20th September 1931, specially chartered trains brought 1,500 workers down from Trafford Park. They arrived, unpacked, and started. On the 1st of October, at 1:16 in the afternoon, the first vehicle rolled off the line. A Ford AA truck, 30 hundredweight. It didn't sell. Britain in 1931 was deep in the Depression, and the market for heavy commercial vehicles had collapsed entirely. Dagenham had opened at the worst possible moment, producing the wrong vehicle for a country that couldn't afford it. What saved it was a small saloon called the Model Y. Launched in 1932, designed specifically for Britain, a 933 cubic centimetre four-cylinder engine and a price of exactly £100. Ford understood the power of a round number. The Model Y took 40% of the market for small cars. In a country buying carefully and watching every penny, it was exactly right. Dagenham had survived its first crisis. It would not be the last. Chapter 3. Dagenham at war. On the 3rd of September, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. Within weeks, Dagenham stopped building cars entirely. The transition was total. A factory owned by an American company became one of the most critical military production sites in Britain. The irony was not lost on anyone. Detroit money, English hands, building the machinery of British survival. The war list was long. Dagenham produced military trucks across 6 specifications, code-named WOT1 through WOT6, ranging from 3-ton cargo lorries down to staff cars and light field vehicles. It built mobile field kitchens, winches for barrage balloons over British cities, and the Bren gun carrier, a light-tracked vehicle powered by the Ford V8 engine, adaptable enough for reconnaissance, troop transport, and supply runs across every theater of the war. By the time peace came, Dagenham had produced 360,000 military vehicles. Ford's second British factory in Manchester contributed something different. 34,000 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines built under license for more than 40 types of aircraft. Among them, the Spitfire. Among them, the Hurricane. The engines that flew the Battle of Britain were, in no small part, assembled by Ford workers in the north of England. But Dagenham's contribution to the war went beyond vehicles and engines. Britain in wartime needed food as urgently as it needed weapons. The U-boat campaign was strangling Atlantic supply lines, and domestic agriculture was pushed hard to compensate. That farming effort ran on the Fordson tractor. At the peak of wartime production, Fordson accounted for 95% of all agricultural tractors operating in Britain. The fields that fed the country ran on Ford engines. In 1941, Edsel and Henry Ford returned 50% of the dividends owed to them by their British operation. The money went into building 450 mobile canteen vans. Those vans went to the bombed cities: London, Coventry, Plymouth, Bristol, and served over 6 million meals to civilians whose homes and local shops had been destroyed. A practical act of charity at industrial scale and entirely voluntary. The war also changed who worked on the line. For the first time in Dagenham's history, women entered the factory in significant numbers, filling roles vacated by men called up for service. They operated machinery, assembled components, and kept the production figures moving. It was a shift that would leave its mark on the factory long after the fighting stopped. On the 27th of August, 1946, a Ford Prefect saloon rolled off the line. It was the 1 millionth vehicle Dagenham had ever built. 15 years, 1 world war, 1 million cars, trucks, tractors, and military transports, built on a patch of Essex swamp that engineers had spent 2 years making solid enough to stand on. The celebration was brief. 6 years of wartime rationing had built up a demand that was now ready to break. People wanted cars. Dagenham was ready to build them. Chapter 4. The Golden Age. The war ended. The rationing didn't, not immediately. But the demand was coiled and waiting, and when it finally released, Dagenham was ready. What followed was something that is difficult to fully picture today. By 1953, 40,000 people were clocking in at Dagenham every single day. 40,000. To put that in context, that is larger than the entire population of many British market towns. They arrived in shifts around the clock, day, evening, night. So the factory never slept. The gates never closed. The line never stopped. At its peak, Dagenham was producing a finished vehicle every few minutes around the clock, every working day of the year. Iron ore arrived by cargo ship at the private Thames jetty. It left as a completed car. The steel was smelted on site. The bodies were pressed on site. The engines were machined on site. From raw material to road-ready vehicle, all of it on the same 475 acres. No other car factory in Europe came close to that level of integration. Not Morris, not Opel, not Citroën. 1 in every 3 cars on British roads in the 1950s had been built at Dagenham's. 1 in 3. A £75 million redevelopment program, completed in 1959, added 50% more floor space and doubled production capacity. Ford was not managing a factory. It was running an industrial city. The cars that came out of it became part of British identity in ways that went well beyond transport. In 1950, the Consul and the Zephyr debuted at Earl's Court. The first Fords with monocoque construction, shell and chassis fused into one structure, lighter and stiffer than anything before them. Modern cars. Britain noticed. In 1959 came the Anglia 105E. That distinctive reverse-rake rear window that divided opinion and sold in vast numbers regardless. A generation grew up in the back seat of one. Decades later, it appeared in a film about a boy wizard, and a new generation recognized the shape without being told what it was. That is cultural permanence. Then, in 1962, the Cortina. Not glamorous, not fast, practical, durable, affordable, and available. Exactly what the country needed. By the time production ended in 1981, Dagenham had built over 3 million of them. The Cortina was Britain's best-selling car every year from 1973 to 1982. A decade at the top. In a market that competitive, that is a staggering record. Nearby stood the Becontré estate, at the time the largest public housing development in the world. 27,000 homes, 120,000 residents. The estate and the factory were inseparable in practice. Dagenham employed the people who lived there. Becontré housed the people who worked there. Fathers brought sons. Grandfathers who had arrived on those chartered trains in 1931 watched their grandchildren clock in at the same gates. Oil in the blood, the locals called it. But there was another cost. One that wouldn't show up for another decade. The scale that made Dagenham so powerful also made it extraordinarily difficult to change. A factory built at this size, around these production lines for these volumes, had a fixed logic to it. It could run efficiently, or it could stop. What it could not easily do was adapt. The bigger the machine, the harder it is to steer. There was a darker side too, and the people who lived it were honest about it. A former worker described the production line as slow attrition. The pace was relentless. They wouldn't stop that line, he said. You could be dying, and they wouldn't stop it. Year by year, shift by shift, the body paid the price. That cost was rarely discussed. The Golden Age was real, but it had already written the terms of what would come next. Chapter 5. 187 women and a law. In a factory of 40,000 people, 187 of them were women. They worked in the sewing room, making seat covers for Ford's cars. The Zephyr, the Cortina, everything rolling off the Dagenham line. It was skilled work. The covers had to be cut precisely, stitched to pattern, fitted without fault. If the seat covers weren't ready, the cars couldn't be finished. If the cars couldn't be finished, the line stopped. Which is exactly what happened. In the summer of 1968, Ford undertook a workforce regrading exercise. When the results came back, the women in the sewing room found their work had been downgraded. They had been classified as Category C, skilled production operatives. Under the new grading, they became Category B, less skilled in Ford's official judgment. The pay cut was 15%. That alone would have caused anger. But the women soon discovered something that made the regrading feel less like an administrative error and more like a deliberate statement. Male workers doing comparable tasks elsewhere in the factory had kept their higher grade, and the teenage boys hired to sweep the floors, boys with no training and no particular skill of any kind, were earning more per hour than the women who cut and stitched the seats. 5 women decided they had heard enough. Rose Boland, Eileen Pullen, Vera Syme, Gwen Davis, and Sheila Douglas were not trade union officials. They were not political activists. They were machinists who had spent years doing work that Ford now claimed was unskilled, and they had run out of patience. On the 7th of June 1968, all 187 women in the Dagenham sewing room put down their work and walked out. The effect was immediate. Without seat covers, cars on the line could not be completed. Within days, production at Dagenham ground to a halt. The strike spread to Ford's Halewood plant in Liverpool. The total cost to Ford exceeded $8 million. 40,000 workers were affected, and still management refused to negotiate. The instruction to Sir William Batty, Ford's managing director, was to do his worst. The company calculated the women would run out of money first. They were wrong. The strike generated its own momentum, including one moment nobody had planned. A press photographer caught a group of women marching with a banner reading, "We want sex equality." The banner hadn't been fully unfurled when the shutter clicked. What appeared in the next morning's papers was simply, "We want sex." The image spread everywhere. Suddenly, a dispute over job classifications at a car factory in East London was front-page news across the country. 4 weeks in, Barbara Castle, Secretary of State for Employment in Harold Wilson's government, intervened. She brokered a settlement. Ford would increase the women's pay to 92% of the male rate for their grade. The women voted to return. They had won something, but not everything. The original demand had not been about pay alone. It had been about classification. The insistence that making seat covers was skilled work, that the women doing it deserved the same grade as men doing comparable jobs. That demand was not met. The women returned at a better wage, but at the same lower grade, still paid less than they argued they should be. The fight moved to a different arena. In 1970, Parliament passed the Equal Pay Act, the first legislation in British history establishing that men and women performing the same work were entitled to the same pay. The Dagenham strike had not caused the act alone, but it had made further delay politically impossible. The connection was direct and widely acknowledged at the time. At Dagenham itself, The full regrading took another 16 years. In 1984, after a second strike lasting 6 weeks and an independent arbitration ruling, Ford finally reclassified the sewing machinists as skilled workers. It had taken the company 16 years to concede what the women had been saying since 1968. The story traveled further than anyone expected. In 2010, it became a film. In 2014, a West End musical, and the new streets built on the cleared land where Ford's old stamping plant once stood are named after the women who led the walkout. A small permanent record of what 187 people with sewing machines managed to change. They didn't just win a pay dispute, they helped rewrite the rules of work in Britain. Chapter 6. Ford of Europe, and the question nobody asked. In 1967, Ford created Ford of Europe, headquartered in Cork, Ireland. On paper, it was sensible restructuring, bringing the British and German operations under one management structure, standardizing the product range, eliminating duplication. Rational. Efficient. Exactly the kind of decision that looks straightforward in a boardroom and takes decades to understand on the factory floor. What it actually did was change what Dagenham was. Before 1967, Dagenham was Ford's European flagship. The plant that had built Britain's cars since 1931 supplied the war effort and employed 40,000 people at its peak. It had history, scale, and weight. It was irreplaceable. After 1967, it was one factory among several, required to justify itself against Cologne, the new plant at Saarlouis, and the one being planned in Valencia. Cost per unit. Output per worker. Days lost to industrial action. Investment required per vehicle. In those terms, Dagenham, older, more complicated, carrying more legacy infrastructure, was always going to struggle. The question nobody asked aloud, but that every investment decision after 1967 was quietly answering. If you could build the same car in Germany for less, and in Spain for even less, why would you keep building it in Essex? In 1970, Ford's Saarlouis plant in West Germany came online. Built from scratch with modern equipment and efficient layouts, its output per worker was higher than Dagenham from the first day. Not because the German workers worked harder, because the plant was new, and Dagenham was not. New machinery runs faster, new layouts waste fewer steps. That advantage was structural, permanent, and impossible to match without rebuilding from the ground up. In 1976, Ford opened Almusafiz outside Valencia. The Fiesta was now produced simultaneously at Dagenham, Cologne, and Valencia. 3 factories, 1 vehicle. For the customer, it made no difference. For Dagenham, it was a fundamental shift. The plant was no longer the source of anything. It was one option among 3. When Ford's planners allocated production each quarter, the question was not about history or heritage. It was about which option was cheapest. The logic was cold. When 3 plants produce the same car, the cheapest gets the most work, the most expensive gets the least. Dagenham, oldest buildings, most complex infrastructure, highest costs, was not cheapest. In a system designed to compare everything against everything else, the position could not hold indefinitely. The moment Ford of Europe was created, Dagenham stopped being irreplaceable. From that point on, every strike, every extra hour per car on the line, every cost comparison was being measured against Saarlouis and Valencia. Dagenham was always on the wrong side, not through laziness, but because it was the oldest plant in the network, and age carried costs that effort alone could not cancel. Then came the strikes. In 1971, Dagenham was shut for 3 months. The timing was brutal. The Cortina Mark III was in its crucial first year on sale, and scarcity hit at the exact moment the car should have been everywhere. Henry Ford II flew to London and met Prime Minister Edward Heath at Downing Street. Not a courtesy call, a signal that patience had limits. What Ford actually did in response was more consequential than any statement. It routed supply through Germany when Dagenham was idle. British customers who couldn't get a Cortina found one waiting. Built in Cologne, Ford had insulated itself from the disruption, which meant Dagenham had lost something that could never be recovered. You cannot threaten a company with your absence if that company has already learned to function without you. In 1978, Dagenham struck again. Workers demanded 30%. The Labour government under Callaghan had set a 5% ceiling on wage increases to control inflation. Workers whose real wages had been falling for years rejected it and walked out. The strike cost Ford an estimated £10 million per day. It ended above the government's limit, contributing to the collapse of the incomes policy and the broader unrest that became known as the Winter of Discontent. Meanwhile, British Leyland was showing what the worst version of this looked like. Its Cowley plant averaged close to one industrial dispute per day. Cars were built to variable standards and delivered late. Ford took market share aggressively, and by the end of the decade was Britain's dominant car brand, having overtaken British Leyland permanently. But that was a Ford of Europe victory, not a Dagenham one. The cars being sold were increasingly built in Germany and Spain. Dagenham was still part of the operation. It was no longer the heart of it. The question nobody had asked in 1967 was being answered, year by year, one investment decision at a time. And Dagenham was not going to like the answer. Chapter 7. The line pulls back. The 1980s began with a new car and a quiet signal. In 1982, Ford launched the Sierra, the replacement for the Cortina, the car that had been Dagenham's biggest success and one of the best-selling vehicles in British history. The Sierra was different in almost every way from its predecessor. Where the Cortina had been conservative and familiar, the Sierra was aerodynamic and divisive, a shape that looked like nothing else on British roads and immediately attracted strong opinions on both sides. But the more significant difference was where it was built. Right-hand drive versions for the British market came from Dagenham. Left-hand drive versions for the continent came from Ford's plant in Genk, Belgium. For the first time, Dagenham was not the sole source of a major Ford model. It shared production with another factory. That arrangement was presented at the time as practical and efficient. Looking back, it reads as something else. The first stage of a withdrawal that would take another 20 years to complete. In 1990, Ford consolidated all Sierra production in Belgium. Dagenham's share, the right-hand drive versions it had been building since 1982, was transferred to Genk. The Sierra left Dagenham entirely, and the Fiesta became the only car still being assembled there. A factory that had once produced the Prefect, the Anglia, the Zephyr, the Cortina, and the Sierra was now a one-model plant. The range had been reduced to a single entry in the smallest segment of the market. In 1993, the Mondeo arrived, the Sierra's successor and Ford's mid-range family car for the decade. It was not assigned to Dagenham, say it went to Belgium. The pattern that had been establishing itself since the creation of Ford of Europe was now impossible to miss. Each new model represented a new decision about where production would be located. Each time, the decision pointed away from Dagenham. Not dramatically, not with a single announcement, but steadily, model by model, year by year. There was a structural reason behind this that nobody at Dagenham could do much about. Through much of the late 1980s and into the 1990s, the value of sterling was elevated relative to continental currencies, partly a consequence of Britain's position as a significant oil producer, which kept the pound strong in ways that had nothing to do with manufacturing competitiveness. A strong pound meant that British-made goods cost more in export markets and that British production looked expensive in internal Ford cost comparisons. Every time a planner in Cologne or Dearborn put together a spreadsheet comparing the cost of making a car in Dagenham versus making it in Valencia or Saint-Louis, the exchange rate was working against Dagenham. It was not something the workers could fix. It was not something management could negotiate away. It was an economic condition imposed from outside, and it made a difficult position worse. Through all of this, Dagenham was not standing still. The factory spent the 1980s and early 1990s investing seriously in its own improvement. Robots were introduced to the body construction process for the Sierra. New stamping equipment was installed. The engine plant, which would eventually become the reason the factory survived at all, was steadily modernized and upgraded. The workforce accepted changes to working practices that, a decade earlier, would have triggered strikes. Productivity improved year by year. By 1997, Dagenham was producing 62 cars per worker annually, a figure that represented genuine progress and genuine effort from everyone involved. But it wasn't enough. A Fiesta built at Dagenham still required 6 more hours of production time than one built at Cologne. 6 hours per vehicle across hundreds of thousands of vehicles per year adds up to a number that cannot be explained away or negotiated down. The reason was not that the Dagenham workers were slower or less committed. The reason was infrastructure. The buildings were older. The layouts had been designed for a different era of manufacturing. The flow of components through the plant had been modified and patched over decades until it was a compromise of compromises. A new factory, designed from scratch, simply did not carry those inefficiencies. You cannot work your way out of a building that was designed in the 1920s. In 1997, Ford gave Dagenham what appeared to be a lifeline. The company committed, in writing to the British government, that Dagenham would be the lead plant for the next generation of the Fiesta. The investment would come. The future was secure. For the workforce and the trade unions, this was significant enough to justify a major concession. Ford's other British assembly plant at Halewood on Merseyside, where the Escort had been built for years, would be closed. The work would be consolidated at Dagenham. Halewood's workers would lose their jobs so that Dagenham could keep its. It was a trade. Liverpool for Essex, Halewood for Dagenham. The unions accepted it. The government endorsed it. The commitment was signed. And 3 years later, Ford broke it. The 1997 promise would not be the last chapter, but it was the moment the shape of the ending became visible, even if nobody wanted to say it out loud. A factory that had been told it was the future had begun to understand, quietly and without ceremony, that the future had already been decided somewhere else. Chapter 8. The decision was made somewhere else. By the late 1990s, if you knew what to look for, you could see it. Not in any announcement, in the small things. The way requests for new equipment were handled. The language managers used when talking about the future. Parts that took too long to arrive. Problems patched rather than fixed. Workers who had spent 20 years on the line had learned, over those 20 years, to read these signs. By the end of the decade, the signs at Dagenham were consistent, and they all pointed in the same direction. This plant was not the future. Ford's plants in Valencia and Saar-Louis had been re-equipped through the 1980s and 1990s with successive generations of modern technology. Robotic welding arms, automated guided vehicles moving components between stations without human direction. Computer-controlled paint systems applying consistent finishes with almost no variation. Infrastructure that let a car move through production faster and with fewer defects than anything depending on older buildings. Dagenham was still running, in substantial part, under roof structures built in the 1920s. The original buildings, designed before any of the machinery inside them had been conceived, were still there, still shaping production around their fixed geometry. Ford had invested seriously in the engine plant, which was genuinely world-class. Parts of the assembly operation had been upgraded, but the fundamental fabric of the site, the walls, the load-bearing columns, the positions fixed by concrete piles driven into the Thames clay in 1929, had not changed in 70 years. A Ford internal assessment concluded that retooling Dagenham to build the next generation Fiesta, the Mk5, would require not just new machinery, but structural work on the foundations themselves. The 22,000 concrete piles driven into the clay in 1929 fixed the load-bearing points in positions that did not suit modern manufacturing layouts. Installing the equipment the new Fiesta required meant addressing the foundations first, and addressing the foundations of a 475-acre complex was not a project. It was something close to a complete rebuilding from the ground upwards. The calculation was brutal. Building a new plant in Valencia from scratch would cost less than converting Dagenham to do the same work. The factory had become a victim of its own original ambition. Built to last, driven deep into the earth for permanence. Precisely because of that permanence, it was impossible to remake without extraordinary expense. The stronger the foundations, the harder they are to move. On the production floor, the workers who had been there longest understood what was happening before anyone said it out loud. When a factory has a future, worn tooling gets replaced quickly and without argument. At Dagenham in the late 1990s, worn tooling got repaired, patched through another week, another month on equipment that was past its best. The workers had the skill to compensate for the deficiencies. But compensating for old equipment is not the same as having the right tools, and the difference showed up in every productivity comparison Ford's European planners were running. When a factory has a future, management talks about long-term improvements. The next model cycle, the investment arriving, what the plant looks like in a decade. The language at Dagenham had shifted to this year's output targets, this quarter's commitments, near-term metrics. Workers who had listened to that language for 2 decades recognized the change. It was the vocabulary of a place being managed for the short term, not built for the long one. Nobody said it directly. The language said it for them. Parts shortages became routine. A missing component, a delayed delivery. Small supply failures that halted the line until resolved. In a plant, Ford was actively prioritizing. Disruptions got fixed fast. At Dagenham, they took longer. The workers managed around them as they always had. But managing around supply failures is itself a cost, and over time it registered in every comparison. The deeper truth, the decision to end car assembly at Dagenham had not been made in May 2000. It had been made incrementally, through choices that each looked defensible alone, but which together described a direction that was irreversible before anyone named it publicly. When Ford declined to assign Sierra production to Dagenham in 1990, that was a decision. When the Mondeo went to Belgium in 1993, that was a decision. When each new model favored the Continental plants, those were decisions. By the time Ford issued its 1997 commitment to make Dagenham the lead plant for the next Fiesta, the engineers may already have known the commitment could not be honored. The 1997 announcement was about managing the workforce and the government through a transition already decided in rooms far from Essex. The unions, accepting the deal, agreed to close Halewood on Merseyside. Jobs in Liverpool, gone, in exchange for a written guarantee that Dagenham's future was secure. When Ford walked away 3 years later, the unions had spent their only bargaining chip. Liverpool had been sacrificed for Essex, and Essex was being closed anyway. That was the real ending. Not the final Fiesta on the 20th of February 2002. Not the photographs and the workers signing their names on the last car. Those things happened at the finish line. The race had been decided long before anyone crossed it. Chapter 9. The Last Red Fiesta. In the final months of 2001, the Dagenham production floor was quieter than it had been in decades. Not silent. The remaining lines were still running, and the engine plant was at full capacity. There was still noise, machinery, movement, the steady rhythms of a factory that hadn't stopped. But there were parts of the site that had gone dark. Buildings that had once held dozens of workstations were now empty. Equipment removed or standing idle. The lights were off. Nobody walked through those sections anymore. Workers who had been there long enough to know what a factory looks like when it is being wound down could read those dark buildings without any help, You didn't need an official announcement. The empty bays were the announcement. By 2001, only one vehicle was still being assembled at Dagenham, the Fiesta. A factory that had produced the Prefect, the Anglia, the Zephyr, the Zodiac, the Cortina, the Capri, the Sierra. A factory that had been the source of dozens of models across 7 decades, had been reduced to a single small car in the smallest segment of the market. The range that had once defined British motoring had contracted, model by model and year by year, until this was all that remained. Ford announced that Dagenham would become the company's global center for diesel engine production. The engine plant would grow and modernize. The future was in powertrains, not bodywork. The redundancy packages offered to departing assembly workers were described as the most generous in the history of British manufacturing. The kind of statement made when you need a large number of people to leave quietly and without significant disruption. Some took the packages and went. Others stayed as long as they could, and among those who stayed were workers who had been there long enough to have seen everything, who had started in the 1960s or early 1970s, worked through the strikes and the contraction of the 1990s, who had watched the models disappear one by one across 3 decades. For them, the final weeks carried a weight that was difficult to describe from outside and completely clear from within. They knew what was ending. They had spent their working lives building it. The 20th of February, 2002, was a Wednesday. Grey, flat light, damp air, the Thames somewhere in the background behind the site. Nothing about the morning announced itself as historic. A shift like other shifts, except that it was the last one. At some point that day, on one of the Fiesta assembly lines at Dagenham, the last car reached the end of the production process. A Fiesta, cherry red. Nothing technically different from the thousands assembled on that same line in the weeks and months before. Same engine, same body panels, same interior trim. A completely ordinary car. Except that it was the last one. And the workers on the line that day knew exactly what that meant. They signed it, wrote their names on the bodywork, on the roof, on the bonnet, along the doors. Some had been at Dagenham for 20 or 30 years. Some had fathers who worked there before them. They signed their names on a cherry-red Ford Fiesta because the gesture felt necessary, because it meant something even if nobody could quite say what. Some cried. Others didn't. One worker, asked what the final minutes had been like, said simply, "Nobody spoke. Everyone just stood there looking at each other." There was nothing to say. In 71 years of operation, from the first Ford AA truck on the 1st of October 1931 to that final Fiesta on the 20th of February 2002, Dagenham had built exactly 10,980,368 vehicles. Cars, trucks, tractors, military transports. Placed end to end, they would stretch for more than 400,000 kilometers, more than 10 times around the Earth. The machines were switched off. The line stopped. What followed happened slowly across the decade that came after. The workforce that had peaked at 40,000 in 1953 was now around 2,000 in the engine plant Ford had designated as the site's future. In 2012, the stamping plant, part of Dagenham since the 1930s, closed, another 1,000 jobs gone. More buildings were demolished, more land was cleared and left empty. That same year, the cleared ground where Ford's assembly buildings had stood became a secret rehearsal site for the London Olympics opening and closing ceremonies. For months, performers and production teams worked on the empty concrete floor, staging the spectacle that would be seen by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. On the ground where cars had been built, a ceremony was assembled. In 2020, during the pandemic, Ford converted an empty Dagenham warehouse into a ventilator production facility in 3 weeks. At its peak, 500 people a day built breathing equipment for NHS intensive care units. The factory that had built Bren carriers for the British Army in 1940 was building ventilators 80 years later. The scale was different. The instinct was the same. Today, the Dagenham engine plant is Ford's largest diesel manufacturing facility in Europe. Around 2,000 workers produce approximately 1.4 million engines a year, supplying Ford Transits and commercial vehicles. A serious and productive operation. But it is not what Dagenham was. Where the assembly building stood, a new residential development called Beam Park is being built. Its streets carry the names of the women who led the 1968 strike. Boland Road, Pullen Way, small permanencies of memory embedded in the geography of a place being remade into something else. The factory Henry Ford built on an Essex swamp that produced nearly 11 million vehicles, that helped arm Britain through a world war, that gave 187 women with sewing machines the platform to change British law, is still there. Diminished, repurposed, still making engines, still employing people in the borough it has been part of for 90 years. Just not cars, not anymore. Chapter 10. What the silence teaches. Dagenham did not fail. It was not defeated. No competitor built a better car. No disaster destroyed the site. No scandal brought the company down. It was ended by the same organization that built it, through decisions that were each individually defensible and that collectively amounted to a verdict that had been forming for 30 years before anyone wrote it down. That is what makes Dagenham worth thinking about. Not the dramatic moments, the strikes, the final fiesta, the photographs, but the quieter logic underneath them, the logic that turns advantages into liabilities over time, that makes the indispensable gradually optional, that allows an empire to be switched off rather than conquered. There are lessons in that logic, not comfortable ones. The first concerns the permanence of early decisions. The 22,000 concrete piles driven into the Thames clay in 1929 made Dagenham possible. They also made it impossible to remake. Every advantage that came from building early and at integrated scale became, over time, a constraint. The site designed for one era of manufacturing could not be reconfigured for another without costs that exceeded the value of keeping it running. Build early, build deep, and you are committing to a future you cannot fully predict. The stronger the foundations, the harder they are to move. The second lesson is about what happens when you stop being necessary. Ford built Sarlouis in Valencia to insulate itself against disruption at Dagenham. Rational, given the years of unrest. It worked. The next time Dagenham stopped, the cars kept coming from Germany and Spain, and customers barely noticed. Dagenham had lost the one thing that had always protected it, the fact there was no alternative. The moment a credible alternative exists, the negotiation changes. The moment you can be replaced, you have already lost something that will not come back. The third lesson concerns industrial relations. The strikes were not irrational. Workers had real grievances, and the 1968 women's strike produced a law that changed Britain permanently. But the accumulation of disputes across 3 decades had an effect that went beyond any individual event. Each one gave Ford a reason to invest somewhere else. Nobody lost the factory in a single strike. But across 30 years, the strikes contributed significantly to losing it. The fourth lesson is the hardest. Dagenham was not destroyed by external competitors. Toyota did not kill Dagenham. Volkswagen did not. Dagenham was ended by Ford, by the internal allocation of investment, by successive decisions about which plant got which model, by a cost comparison that consistently favored the newer facility. Organizations are brought down more often by internal choices than by outside forces. The enemies you can name are rarely the ones that finish you. Dagenham was not only a factory. For 70 years it was the economic foundation of a community. Tens of thousands of families whose stability and sense of identity was tied to a single employer in a single place. When the employer made its decisions, those families absorbed the consequences. The legacy is not only industrial. Nearly 11 million vehicles, 360,000 military transports that helped win a world war. and the Equal Pay Act of 1970. Legislation that came directly from the refusal of 187 women to accept a job classification they knew was unjust. That act changed the legal relationship between employers and female workers across Britain permanently. It is arguably the most consequential thing that ever happened at Dagenham, more lasting than any production record, more important than any car. On the 20th of February, 2002, the machines at Dagenham were switched off for the last time out through the same gates they had used for years, carrying 71 years of industrial history and the weight of an ending that had been visible long before anyone was ready to say it. Dagenham is not gone. The engine plant continues, but the thing Henry Ford came to an Essex swamp to build, the automotive empire, the self-sufficient industrial city, the factory that put Britain on wheels, that is quiet now. The silence is the lesson. What you build, how you build it, and the decisions you make over time about who is necessary and who is not. Those things echo long after the line stops. Dagenham echoes still.